Hi, Donna.
Hey, how are you? Oh,
Good.
there we
How are you? There you are. Hello.
Hello.
So
Thank
glad
you.
you're joining us.
Certainly. Thank you.
We were just enjoying chatting about your book. We're glad we got to read it early.
Okay, great. Uh,
Well, why don't we start out? I'm going to ask you just generally to tell us a little bit about, I know some of the story is a little bit the story of your family. So it'd be interesting to hear how you decided to write the book, what parallels with your family, what doesn't. Do you mind telling us a little bit about that?
sure. So the my grandparents went to Cuba in 1919, and so they went separately, met there, got married, had a few children in Cuba, and then came back to then went back to Jamaica. And so that I knew as a child, just those basic facts that they were in Cuba for some time. But I didn't really know anything at all about their experience, exactly why they went and why they chose to return to Jamaica. So that was a large part of what I wanted to find out. And to figure that out, I decided to write a book. So the second part of it that sort of parallels my family story is that I'd always heard that my grandmother had a brother who had gone to Cuba and who just never came back to Jamaica. And so I wondered what that was like having a sibling who you had lost contact with and I knew nothing at all about his adult life. So knowing that, I wanted to try to explore what that felt like, which is why I chose to have Perlene have siblings who were left behind in Cuba.
So did you have to do a lot of research for this one?
Yeah, quite a lot of research because I did not know very much at all about what the experience of Jamaicans were in Cuba. So that was a large part of it. And yeah, just the time period was also something that I didn't really know very much about. So it took a lot of research, both academic type stuff and asking some questions, but a lot of it was really just trying to understand like what happened, how did circumstances change for Jamaicans or well migrants in general from the English speaking Caribbean and French speaking Caribbean who went to Cuba.
So haunting seems to be a theme throughout the book, people feeling haunted, these things hanging over them. Tell us more about that.
It's just superstition, a lot of stuff that, you grew up hearing that, people talking about their relatives who either come back to speak to them or tell them what numbers to play for the lottery, stuff like that. I don't have that kind of luck because nobody gives me those kind of stories or numbers. But a lot of it was really looking at and playing with that whole idea of what you're haunted by. Because I think sometimes it's our own actions, but it's also sometimes what another family member has done that I think you think is either following you or is becoming a part of your story. So I think we're all haunted by something, our own actions, or family members, or just something in our lives. So I wanted to play with that, and also the sense that somebody asks you to do something, and if you don't do it, you feel that that person is going to haunt you. After that person has died, you feel that person is going to haunt you. And so that's what I wanted to have that sense that like there is this one thing that Rupert had wanted done. And one child he asks to do it. And if she doesn't, it's both the guilt of not getting it done and just this idea that his spirit is restless and he will be coming back until that thing is done.
And she's probably feeling some of her own guilt because she's been gone for so long and she's just back. And so she feels probably this extra duty to him as well.
Right. Yeah, there's certainly some of that. This sense that, yeah, she hasn't been there to take care of him in a way that I think she wanted to. And I, and I think that's something that I think very many of us experience, whether, once you move away from home and you are living somewhere else, whether it's a different country or just a different state, there is the sense that your parents or, other relatives as they get older, they might need your help, but you can't do it either because you are in a place that you like or you want to be in, or your hometown just really doesn't offer you the opportunities that you would like to have. So I think there is just so much of that for very many people who are um, pretty much at any age. It could, because you could be, like a 30-year-old still having that kind of angst. But I think for so many other people, when you're a little bit older, 50s or 60s, like with much older parents who are getting up there in age, it becomes even more acute. So yeah, I think there's a lot of that I think hangs in the story, what your duty is to family and what your duty is to yourself. That I think Pearline has to, try to understand.
And it's very hard sometimes to reconcile those two.
Yeah, it definitely is. Yeah.
So we had a question when there's the X is written on the outside of the house and then the furniture's rearranged. Was that her sisters that came in and did that, or do we not know what happened?
Yeah, one of the sisters came in and did that, and I
Okay.
think it was Ermina who did it.
Okay.
Yeah.
We were trying to remember, but then I knew you said she'd done it the X's again. So just kind of one of those things they did to try to prevent the haunting.
Yeah, actually, one of my cousins, I remember when her daughter died, I went to the house and, like she had these X's on the door, and I had just never heard of that, when I was growing up, and so I was surprised. And she told me, yeah, this is what she was doing so her daughter wouldn't come back. I mean, I don't know that, I don't know that I would be afraid of somebody that close. That's not a person who I think is going to harm me, but yeah, that's what she did. And so if people are still doing that now, because this was what, maybe 6 7 years ago, people are still using I guess sticking to some of those practices, which was interesting to me.
Very interesting. You know what it reminded me of is like during the Black Plague and some of those times when you'd have homes that where people were sick and you weren't supposed to go in and they would mark them that way. It just made me think of that for some reason as well,
Right. Yeah.
to tie in with that. Well, we were talking about the title and the cover because we love the cover, and the title because it's so interesting, The House of Plain Truth, when the truth isn't there at all. So tell us a little bit about like how you came up with that and if you wanted that to be the title and just your thoughts on it.
Well, this book has had multiple titles. It started out as, I think, Voices from the Sea was one of the original titles, and then The Tree of a Thousand Feet, and then we landed on The House of Plain Truth, and that actually was Zibby's suggestion after she read it again after I'd done some revisions, and it made sense because that is what really pulls the story together. It's the idea of the house itself is what holds the truth of this family, and yet the truth is none of them really know it, or the children didn't know it. They've grown up with this house thinking that it's theirs, it belongs to them, whereas their mother knew the story behind it, and she was the one who gave the property that name, the House of Plain Truth. So there's so much, within the family history that has to come out in order for them to really understand what that name meant to their mother and to them as as sisters carrying on the family legacy.
We just thought that was really interesting because, as you mentioned, they say it's a house of plain truth, but then it did hold the truth, but there were so many secrets and so many untruths and things that they didn't know.
Yeah.
And then the cover, did you have a say in that?
I liked it. They presented me with a cover and I really liked it.
I love it. I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's a beautiful cover, and I love the way the house is, like set back in that mirror, and then, like sorted in the foliage, which I think harks back to that idea that, you're opening this curtain sort of to see what the truth is. So I like it. It works very well for the story.
It does. And Kelly just popped in. The cover is so unique and beautiful. And I agree. And I think that's one of the things I liked about it, because I think cover trends these days, so many of them are so similar. And it's just nice when you see something that's so unique and different, but really encapsulates the story as well.
Thank you.
I've been asking a ton of questions. Does anybody have anything they want to ask? Sidra? I can't.
Practice to Can you hear me?
No, I
Sorry.
can't. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Is it practice to have people come over after someone passes for the week long that you had in the story?
It is, and in some communities in Jamaica, I think people still do it throughout. So yeah, I think it's 9 nights usually of this kind of coming together, and I think you're there to support the family and to just tell stories, talk, and eat and drink and drink and drink and drink. And I think it has become it has morphed in some ways, because I see some pictures on social media where people are having what it really ends up being huge celebrations, with like a DJ and a big party and stuff, not every night, but like somewhere in that process. And I don't understand where that has come from, but like it has morphed in a lot of different ways. And so I think a lot of those traditions certainly go back to or fall back to traditions from West Africa. And I think people have just I continue to practice like this whole sense that you're supporting the family, but you're also in some ways ushering the dead person onto this new life. So there is there are a lot of different rituals that I guess um that people practice throughout that week, that are all intended to do something different. So it's either ushering the person on or just simply supporting the family members.
And celebrating the life of the deceased, yeah. Anybody else have a question they want to ask?
I have a
I'm always
question. Oh,
go ahead.
sorry. Go ahead, Val.
I'm always curious where authors come up with their character names, because that's those names are with you through the whole journey of your book. Did these reflect your family members, or how did you come up with your character names?
There's some that reflect my family members. My grandmother's name was Annie, and so there's an Annie there. My grandfather's name was Eustace, but I shifted that and made that Rupert instead of Eustace. Perline is actually the name of one of my aunts who was born in Cuba, actually. So yeah, there's some names that are family members, not necessarily for no specific reason other than that I like the name. And yeah, usually tell people, if you ask to be named in a book, you might not like the person you're named after, so just don't ask. But I try to sometimes just pick names that are familiar to me.
Thank you.
Great question.
I was curious just about the publishing journey in general. And since this is I think it was Zibby's last book of 2023, just this big year of all of these new books for her, how that went for you.
The process has been, I mean, quite interesting actually, because this is my third book. So I've gone through, and the third publisher. So I've gone through three different processes. So I actually really like the process. I like what they're doing. I like how they pull authors in and how we're involved in things like the, like decision on the cover, the marketing aspect, like conversations like this with early readers. There's just so much that I think is happening for me in this process that just didn't happen previously. But that's also, my last book came out in 2020. So that too was a
Oh,
different experience.
yeah, definitely. Oh, I was always curious, but that's great. It seems like um, they do a lot of extra things on the reader side, and so it's just interesting to hear on the author side how that went.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. It's and it's nice to see this process and to see the evolution, like a new publisher that's come in and is actually, like building from the ground up, whereas in most other cases you are stepping into a publishing company that has, like all processes and everything fully entrenched, and they're not necessarily very, like either nimble or flexible in some ways. But it's
Mhm.
nice to be involved with a new publisher that, like, has a lot of flexibility to do
Yeah.
new things or try new things.
Oh, well, that's great. We're excited to have the book come out.
Well, thank you.
So what has that been like with three different publishers? Do you find that interesting that you're comparing and contrasting, thinking, oh, we did it this way? Does it help you kind of sometimes give advice to this publisher and say, well, we did this one time, it worked really well, or have you just kind of been interested to see how it all plays out for you?
Yeah, I've just been interested to see how it plays out. And like a lot of it is every publisher is just so different, that it's hard to compare. But like it's a lot easier to say, oh, you're doing this. Oh, thank you very much. I did not have that before. I'm really happy to see that somebody's doing this. So a lot of it is more like like in my case, just acceptance or and happiness in some ways that there are some things that like a publisher is doing for me that I don't necessarily have to do for myself.
That makes sense. And I think her model is so interesting because of having her own bookstore, having her podcast. She's kind of she is new, but she's not new to the book world at all.
Right. Yeah. And that is exactly how I met Zibby, because I was on her podcast when my second book came out, which, like, so once I heard she was doing a publishing company, like my agent then sent this new manuscript on to her. So I think there's a lot of things that she can bring from her world, both the podcast and, like those kinds of marketing things that, like I think traditional publishers or older publishers would rely on somebody else to do. But Zibby has so much that she is able to pull in, both with a bookstore and with the podcast and everything else. And so it's a refreshing experience. And I'll wait to see what happens in January.
Exactly. And I think doing a book a month really helps because then the focus is on the person whose book it is, so I think it's wonderful. I'm really excited to see what she's doing.
Right. Yeah.
Let's talk about your writing process. So do you have a certain time of day you sit down and write, a certain number of words? Do you just write when you have time? What does that look like for you?
I don't know that I really have much of a process. I write. I like to write early in the mornings, because there's not much else going on. My brain is fresh. I'm not answering the phone. I'm not like running errands. So it's a lot easier and better for me to write in the mornings. But even though I say that, or I should say early in the morning, so like like 4 or 5 o'clock, I would like to get up. That's the ideal. And I tell myself that I'm going to continue doing it. It worked really well once. For some reason, I was waking up and I think the book was just simply in my head and I couldn't sleep. And so once I finished working on the book, I was able to go back to sleep and sleep until 6, 7 in the mornings. So I feel like it was just the best time for me to work. But now, because I do like to sleep, I tend to wake up a little bit later and I write when I can. So I try to fit it in. But what is better for me now, or I think helps my process, is that I'm a freelance writer and editor, so I can fit it in a lot more in my life in a way that was not necessarily possible when I had a 9 to 5.
Yes, because you have to work around the 9 to 5 time. Now you can kind of plot everything out and schedule it in when you want to.
Exactly.
What was the editing process like for you? Did things change a lot? Did they stay the same? Were there certain things you really felt were important to you? What did all that look like?
It changed a lot. So the book, after one of the things I knew going in was that I would have to do some revision and some editing. And so I really revised the book from beginning to end. So it was think not fully a year, but pretty close to a year. Long process of redoing the book, reorganizing, reworking it in some ways. So yeah, it was a lovely process because I got instructions from my editors, had a conversation with them, knew what it was that they had, the concerns they had, and how to fix it, and then they left me alone to do the work. So it was a good process. I liked it. Have no
I always
complaints.
think that's interesting because I think some authors come in, and it's your third book, so you would not be thinking that at this point, but come in thinking, here's my book, it's almost ready to go, not realizing how important but also hard the editing process can be at times. And there are certain things that you may feel like, I really want this in here no matter what.
Right. Yeah, I've heard that from a lot of authors, particularly authors who say they're going to self-publish because they don't want somebody else fixing their book or changing their book. But I think a large part of it for me, I look at it as an editor is able to see things that I can't see. And not every editor is the perfect editor for every book, but the right editor will help you to shape that story and make it a whole lot better. And I think any writer who really wants to publish has to be open to this idea that an editor is there to help you, not to diminish your story, not to take away from your story, but to help your story be the best that it can be.
Right. And resonate with people and reach as many readers as possible.
Absolutely.
The other thing that I thought was really interesting in your story was the idea of culture, and Jamaicans living in Jamaica or living with their family, with their culture. But then you take Perline to Brooklyn, and she has left a lot of her family and feels like she's left some of her culture. But then Derek says, Brooklyn's just kind of like a little Jamaica. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of like immigrating and trying to hold on to your culture and kind of feeling other sometimes?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of all of those things, because depending on where you live, there is so much of Jamaica in Brooklyn in particular, and in some areas of Florida, Fort Lauderdale, Miami, that you feel like you haven't left. You can walk into the grocery store and get almost everything that you get at home. You are walking down the street, and the voices that you're hearing are, like Caribbean voices. So there is, depending on where you are, so much of that you don't really leave. But at the same time, there is still a lot that you have left, because you're hearing some bits and pieces, you're getting some of the food, but there is still a lot that you're not getting. It's just the basic everyday aspect of living, like having your family members close by, or being able to drop in. There's so much that is still also just missing. But like I think most of us, I mean, and for me, I go back to Jamaica several times a year, 2, 3 times a year. So there is a lot that I don't think I'm missing, because I go back and I get it so quickly and easily and readily and often. But at the same time, like you're here at, maybe at Christmas, or, for a major holiday, and it's a very different holiday than it would be if you're at home.
I thought that you did a really great job of getting that onto the page, understanding the differences in that. So thank you, because it's helpful for me to understand some of those things.
Right. No, thanks.
I don't want to make sure I'm not the only one asking questions. So does anybody else have questions they want to ask? I don't want to. Nope. So tell me about wanting to be a writer. How did you decide you wanted to write novels?
Actually, when I was in undergrad, I went in with the idea that I would become a lawyer, because everybody wants to help all the downtrodden and the people who can't speak for themselves, basically. And I decided to major in English and media studies as a way to help me to get towards that law degree. And I took a fiction writing workshop, and I liked it, and I started writing some more. And then I also took an independent study with a writer who was teaching at Fordham, where I went. And with that independent study, she introduced me to Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is a book I had never read before. And one of the things that I loved about that book was the language and the community that Zora Neale Hurston created. And so once I started reading that, I felt at home. I felt like these were people who I had grown up around or seen or heard, and I wanted to do the same thing. And I felt that I could do that, like about my communities, about, like a story set in Jamaica. And so that's really where it sort of started. So once I was done, like with my undergrad years, I knew that the next degree that I wanted to get was a creative writing degree. And then I started writing what turned out to be my first novel and applied to grad school. And there we are.
So the law school went out the window.
Oh yeah, that went out the window. And I think it went out very early on. I was watching, I think maybe Law and Order or something. And I saw, like what a lawyer was doing to help a client. And I said, there's no way I'm lying for anybody. So law school went out the window very early. So instead of lying for other people, I do it in fiction. Well, I shouldn't say lie. I create stories in fiction, as opposed to standing in a court and doing it.
Oh, good. Well, it's always so interesting to hear people's paths and who's inspired them and things like that. Well, what is on your nightstand? Like, what do you read?
Well, this year I read a lot of Caribbean literature, partly because I did a series for Zibby Mag about my year of reading in Caribbean literature. And then I've also done a couple of other roundups for other publications about Caribbean writers. So that's pretty much what I've been reading all year. I am hoping to do, like to branch out a little bit more next year and read not books that I have to read because they're tied to my work as a writer, but books that, like I read just simply because I like them. And I haven't started doing that yet because the year isn't over, but January 1, hopefully, I'll, I just get back to just simply just reading for the pleasure of it.
Well, what do you recommend in the Caribbean literature realm?
Well, let's see. One of the books that I read this year and loved is the title just slipped me.
That's the story of my life. People are like, what do you recommend? What have you read lately? And I'm like, that's all I do. And my head just goes blank. So I get it.
Right. It's it has the word God in it. Sorry, can't remember that one. And I just sorry, I need a new ring light. But yeah, I can't remember any of the titles. I have a pile of books here on the floor, but
We need to pull up Zibby Mag's article.
right, a lot of them are in that. Well, one of the books I do remember is The Golden Child, and that came out a few years ago. It's a really lovely book about a family in Trinidad with a set of twin boys, and the father has to make a decision about, like which child he's going to save, and it's a really wonderful story about ambition and desire and well, not so much desire, but more ambition and like who is chosen and who isn't. But it's a really lovely book. And yeah, I
That's
can't
okay.
remember.
That's all right. I just am always so curious to hear what people recommend, since that's what I do so much of. It's always fun to learn about new titles, things, and I don't think I've read a lot set in that area. So that's why I was thinking, no, it would be helpful to have some, but that's okay. I'll find your articles.
Great. Yeah. And I'm sure as soon as I get off this call, I'll remember everything.
You can send them to Sherry and she can send them to me. Well, does anybody else have any more questions they want to ask? Well,
This
Donna,
isn't a
thank you.
question,
Sorry, go ahead,
but
Valerie.
I loved the sense of place that you created in Jamaica, and especially all the descriptions of the native plants. I was Googling all the time to see, well, what does this look like? And what does that look like? So thank you for broadening my horizons in that regard too.
Okay, well, thank you. Good to hear that.
We were also talking about not knowing the history of Jamaicans working in Cuba and then, being expelled. Like that was fascinating to learn all of that history.
Right. Yeah. And I grew up in Jamaica, went to school in Jamaica, finished high school in Jamaica, and I did not know a lot of that either. The nitty-gritty details about the fact that they were invited into Cuba to come to work, and then, like, face so much like discrimination and then expulsion. And so a lot of that I just didn't know. So it was fascinating for me to read all of that, to really get a better understanding of what, like, my grandparents possibly went through. Because I do remember my grandmother saying that, like, she would never go back to Cuba. And, like, I was, like, way too young to even begin to start trying to understand what that meant. But now I do. And like, it really just opened up my eyes to a lot of different things.
Right. And it's interesting as an American because you think of the strained relations that we have with Cuba and have had for so long. And I just wasn't totally familiar with other countries' relations and whether, I know we couldn't travel to Cuba forever, but I didn't know if other people could or not. Like, I just not very familiar with Cuban history. This was teaching me.
Yeah. Well, the thing too is that over the years it has just changed because, like, for Jamaica in particular, because Jamaica has a pretty good relationship with Cuba now. And, like, certainly, and a lot of that started back in like 1970s and 1980s. But knowing the history, like, you would never believe that that was the history based on the current relationship now. But, I guess as with any other country and any situation, relationships grow and change.
They do. And it's just interesting to learn some of that when it's something that we hadn't been introduced to before.
Right.
Do you think you'll ever want to go to Cuba?
Well,
Do you want to go to Cuba? Do you want to do any historical research there?
well, I did go. I went briefly when I started writing this book. But yes, I would love to go back and do more research, do more in depth. If I can, just try to figure out, like, if there's anybody who I'm related to who is left. I mean, I don't know how you do something like that in Cuba. Like, I don't know if people who are doing like DNA type or genetic, like, research and 23andMe or whatever, if they are accessing data from Cuba. That part I don't really know.
I've always wanted to go there. I think it would just be fascinating to see it.
Yeah, it certainly was a really interesting trip, eye-opening in a lot of different ways, just to go and see, in some ways, how much of the country seems to have stopped in time. And it really is fascinating and, like, interesting to see because there's so much else. The rest of the Caribbean doesn't look anything at all like Cuba, from my perspective, from what I've seen of it. And Cuba just feels like more, at least Havana felt more like a replica of Spain, because of course it is Spanish, as opposed to Jamaica, where the infrastructure just looks so very different than it does in Cuba. And it was fascinating for me seeing, these two countries are 90 miles apart, but they feel like they're, so very, very different in some ways.
Worlds apart. And I think the idea, yes, that Cuba kind of stopped, frozen time almost, is just fascinating to me. Anybody else? Dee, did you have something?
You know what, I just would say I would appreciate this book. I'm just reading Things Fall Apart by the Nigerian author. And, I just love how the world is opening up and you learn about all these places that I have never read anything within that. So I appreciate learning about this. This was really fascinating to me because I have read several books about Cuba. And I didn't know this. And I was like, well, where was that in these? And because it's a different perspective, right? So thank you so much for that. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate that as well. I'm glad to hear that.
I'm wondering if you have siblings or cousins and you've gathered all this great family information now. Are you going to share it with them, or are you just going to hand them your book and say, here, read it for yourself?
a combination, but mostly, yes, here's the book, read it. But yeah, I have started sharing and talking a little bit about it. But I think in some ways that once they have read the book, it will make those conversations a lot easier, because then we can talk a little bit more about what like what they're reacting to versus what I've also read and understood and known.
That actually raises another question for me. We talked a little bit about the parents and why they told the story of finding this land, buying it, and building the house versus what really had happened. How did you decide to incorporate that into the story?
Well, I wanted to give them some complexity, or put some complexity around their story. And I think it just felt better than knowing that they came back and really just bought the land. Because I think to a certain extent is that so much went wrong for them in Cuba. And when they came back, they didn't necessarily have all the money that they had thought they were going to save. So they didn't have the resources to come and buy the land and build this house. And so they had to, make up a different story about how they acquired it. So I think that's where that came from. The other thing too is that, one of the stories I had heard about my own grandparents is that my grandfather, when he was in Cuba, had been sending money back to Jamaica. And when he came back, the money was missing. So I wanted to, that was part of what I wanted to do initially, but that felt a little bit too close to home. So I shifted it in a different way, so that it would be that their returning and taking this house really reflected what they came back without. There was this idea, like so many people who had gone to Panama to help build the canal had come back with, like a lot of wealth, or some amount of wealth, I should say. Whereas, like for Rupert and his family, they came back without all of that. And so I wanted to make that contrast. There was one set of people who went and came back and were able to buy and build. And then there was another set who went off and worked and came back. Couldn't do it, not because they didn't want to, but just simply because circumstances didn't allow them to.
I think that makes perfect sense. And the other thing we kind of talked about is how family stories morph and change, and how people kind of look back on things, maybe wish they'd happened one way versus another, and that stories over time sort of reflect that.
Right, yeah. And not only does it reflect that, but the newer generation, depending on what stories they're told, they incorporate so much of that, and it becomes, like who they are. This
Right.
is not who we are. This is not what we do. Whereas, and a lot of that is just simply just the family stories that are passed down. Has nothing to do with you as an individual. It's just what you have heard.
But it becomes part of your story. And so then when it's not really what happened, it can totally throw you.
Right. Yes.
Good. Well, thank you. This was just delightful. We really appreciate your taking the time to chat with us.
Thank you. I'm glad you were able to read the book, and I enjoyed this conversation, and thank you so much for having me.
And good luck with it when it gets out into the world in January.
Certainly. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.